In the twilight of the 19th century, the Russian Empire stood as one of the largest and most powerful nations on Earth. Stretching across 11 time zones, it was a land of extremes, dazzling wealth for the nobility, but crushing poverty for the peasants. At the heart of this vast empire stood one man, Tsar Nicholas II. But Nicholas was no ordinary monarch. He was a man born into unimaginable privilege, yet trapped by responsibility he never wanted. He was deeply devoted to his wife and children, yet blind to the struggles of millions of his subjects. He longed for peace, but presided over wars and revolutions that would tear Russia apart. Nicholas II would become the last Tsar of Russia, the final ruler of a dynasty that had reigned for over 3 centuries. His story is one of personal tragedy, political missteps, and the slow unraveling of an empire that seemed eternal. In this first part of our journey, we'll explore Nicholas's rise to power, the early years of his reign, the coronation disaster that scarred his image, and the humiliating war with Japan that shook Russia's foundations. We'll see how the cracks in the empire grew into a revolutionary storm in 1905, and how Nicholas barely clung to his throne. This is the story of Nicholas II, the last Tsar of Russia. Nicholas Alexandrovich Romanov was born on May 18, 1868, in the Alexander Palace near St. Petersburg. He was the eldest son of Tsar Alexander III and Empress Maria Feodorovna, formerly a Danish princess. From birth, Nicholas was heir to one of the most powerful thrones in the world. But despite his position, his upbringing was surprisingly modest. His father, Alexander III, was a stern and physically imposing ruler, often described as the Iron Tsar. He ruled with an iron fist, determined to preserve autocracy and crush revolutionary movements. He believed in discipline, tradition, and the unshakable authority of the monarchy. Nicholas, however, was nothing like his father. He was gentle, shy, and sensitive. He preferred long walks, reading history, and spending time with his family rather than political debates or military drills. His tutors described him as intelligent and hard-working, but not particularly strong-willed. Alexander III often worried about Nicholas's ability to rule. He once confided to a minister, "My son is utterly unfit to reign." Despite his doubts, he gave Nicholas little practical training in government. Instead, Nicholas grew up sheltered, shielded from the harsh realities of ruling such a vast empire. Still, Nicholas's childhood was happy in many ways. He was close to his siblings, and especially devoted to his mother. He grew up believing in the sanctity of autocracy, the divine right of kings, and the idea that the Tsar was God's chosen ruler of Russia. These beliefs would shape his reign and ultimately contribute to his downfall. When Nicholas was in his 20s, he fell deeply in love with Princess Alix of Hesse, a German princess and granddaughter of Queen Victoria. She would later become his wife, Alexandra Feodorovna, a devoted partner whose influence over Nicholas would become both his comfort and his curse. In 1894, tragedy struck. Tsar Alexander III, Nicholas's father, died unexpectedly at the age of just 49, likely from kidney disease. The young Nicholas, at only 26 years old, suddenly found himself Emperor of Russia. Nicholas was devastated. He had adored his father, and now he faced the overwhelming responsibility of ruling an empire he barely felt prepared to govern. Shortly after his father's death, Nicholas confided to his cousin, "What is going to happen to me and to all of Russia?" I am not prepared to be a Tsar. I never wanted to become one. But duty could not be avoided. In November 1894, Nicholas II was crowned as the new Tsar of all the Russias. He became the autocratic ruler of 126 million people, with authority stretching from the Baltic to the Pacific. Just days after his father's death, Nicholas also married Princess Alix of Hesse, who converted to Orthodoxy and took the name Alexandra Feodorovna. Their marriage was one of true love, rare for royal unions of the time. Nicholas was utterly devoted to Alexandra, writing affectionate letters to her almost daily. She, in turn, adored him. Yet Alexandra was not popular in Russia. She was shy, reserved, and struggled to connect with Russian society. Many viewed her as haughty and cold. Worse, she was German-born, which would later fuel suspicion during times of war. Nicholas, however, was determined to rule as his father had, as an autocrat, unwilling to share power. He believed reform would weaken Russia, and that any concession to liberalism would threaten the throne. He once declared, "I shall maintain the principle of autocracy as firmly and as unflinchingly as did my father." In Nicholas, Russia had a Tsar who was personally kind and gentle, but politically rigid and inexperienced. It was a dangerous combination, one that would soon be tested. Nicholas's reign began under a dark shadow. On May 30th, 1896, his coronation was celebrated in Moscow with enormous pomp. Hundreds of thousands of people gathered for the festivities, which included a public event at Kodinka Field, where free food and gifts were to be distributed. But the event turned to tragedy. Rumors spread that there would not be enough gifts for everyone, and the massive crowd of nearly 500,000 surged forward in panic. In the chaos, people were trampled to death. By the time order was restored, more than 1,300 people lay dead, and thousands more were injured. The disaster shocked Russia. For many, it seemed like a terrible omen for Nicholas's reign. The people expected their new Tsar to show deep mourning and respect. Instead, under pressure from his advisors, Nicholas continued with the planned celebrations that same evening, attending a lavish ball thrown by the French ambassador. This decision outraged many Russians. It made Nicholas seem callous and indifferent to the suffering of his people. Even though Nicholas privately expressed sorrow and later ordered aid for the victims' families, the damage was done. His reputation as a benevolent father to his subjects was permanently stained. The Kodinka tragedy revealed a pattern that would repeat throughout Nicholas's reign. A ruler who felt compassion in private, but who appeared weak, indecisive, or out of touch in public. It was an early sign that the bond between the Tsar and his people was beginning to fray. At the dawn of the 20th century, Russia was a land of contradictions. It was enormous, rich in resources, and growing rapidly. Railways expanded, factories multiplied, and cities swelled with workers. Russia was industrializing faster than ever before. But beneath this progress lay deep problems. The vast majority of Russians were still peasants living in poverty, tied to the land in conditions not far removed from serfdom, which had only been abolished in 1861. In the cities, industrial workers endured long hours, unsafe conditions, and meager pay. Discontent simmered. Revolutionary groups, including Marxists, anarchists, and populists, gained followers among workers and students. Strikes and protests became more common. Meanwhile, the nobility and monarchy remained largely resistant to change. Nicholas II, in particular, clung fiercely to the idea of autocracy. He rejected calls for a constitutional monarchy, insisting that Russia's Tsar ruled by divine right. Nicholas's refusal to modernize politically left Russia increasingly unstable. While countries like Britain and France balanced monarchy with democracy, Russia remained locked in an outdated system that alienated both the intelligentsia and the working classes. Nicholas also faced challenges abroad. Russia sought to expand its influence in Asia, particularly in Manchuria and Korea, where it clashed with a rising new power, Japan. Few in Russia took Japan seriously, dismissing it as a small Asian country. But this arrogance would soon lead Nicholas and his empire into disaster. In 1904, tensions between Russia and Japan exploded into open conflict. Both nations wanted control over Manchuria and Korea, and neither was willing to back down. Nicholas believed Russia would easily crush Japan. After all, Russia was a vast empire with one of the largest armies in the world. But the war quickly turned into a nightmare. In February 1904, Japan launched a surprise attack on the Russian fleet at Port Arthur, crippling Russia's navy. On land, Russian forces suffered defeat after defeat. The final humiliation came in May 1905 at the Battle of Tsushima, where the Russian Baltic Fleet, which had sailed halfway around the world, was annihilated by the Japanese Navy. The war exposed Russia's weaknesses: outdated equipment, poor leadership, and low morale. For Nicholas, it was a personal and national humiliation. Russia had been defeated by an Asian power for the first time in modern history, a shocking blow to national pride. The war also strained Russia's economy and deepened public anger. Food shortages, rising prices, and mounting casualties created unrest at home. By 1905, the empire was on the verge of explosion. The spark came in January 1905. On a freezing Sunday in St. Petersburg, thousands of workers and families marched peacefully to the Winter Palace, led by Father Georgy Gapon. They carried icons and portraits of the Tsar, hoping to present a petition for better working conditions, shorter hours, and a fair wage. But Nicholas was not in the city that day, and the palace guards panicked. They opened fire on the crowd. Hundreds were killed and many more wounded. The day became known as Bloody Sunday. The massacre shattered the image of the Tsar as the little father who cared for his people. Across Russia, strikes, protests, and riots erupted. Peasants seized land. Workers formed councils called Soviets, and mutinies broke out in the army and navy. Nicholas was forced to make concessions. In October 1905, he issued the October Manifesto, which promised civil liberties and the creation of a parliament, the State Duma. For the first time, it seemed that Russia might become a constitutional monarchy. But Nicholas had no intention of sharing real power. As soon as the immediate crisis passed, he undermined the Duma, dismissed ministers who supported reform, and reasserted autocracy. The revolution of 1905 ended in repression. Thousands were executed or exiled, and order was restored. Nicholas had survived, but his popularity never fully recovered. His people no longer saw him as a protector. Instead, they saw a ruler who ignored their suffering, clung to power, and ruled with indifference. By 1905, Nicholas II had faced his first great test as Tsar. He had survived humiliation abroad and revolution at home, but at a terrible cost. The bond of trust between ruler and people was broken. Nicholas continued to believe in his sacred duty as an autocrat, but the world around him was changing. Russia was restless, its people hungry for reform, and its enemies eager to exploit on its weaknesses. Yet within the gilded walls of the palace, Nicholas found comfort in his family. He and Alexandra had welcomed children, and their devotion to one another only grew stronger. But happiness inside the palace would soon bring new troubles. Their son, Alexei, the heir to the throne, was born with a deadly illness. In desperation, Alexandra would turn to a mysterious Siberian mystic, a man whose name would become infamous across Russia, Grigory Rasputin. Nicholas had survived the storm of 1905, but darker clouds were gathering. Ahead lay a world war, another revolution, and the tragic end of a dynasty. Thank you for watching the first part of the life story of Tsar Nicholas II. Stay tuned for the second part on this channel.